Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion presentation on the news media landscape, the evolution of advertising. My name is Paul Adamson, and I'm the chairman of Forum Europe. Let me briefly, before I introduce our first speaker, give you a very brief rundown of what we're going to be presenting on and discussing this morning. As we all know, over the past 2 decades, the media landscape in Western Europe has fundamentally changed, driven by developments in digital and how revenue is generated. The relationship between media publishers and their audiences continues to evolve. As a contribution to this discussion, Forum Europe is pleased to host an online session that will include a presentation and a discussion of a new series of reports from Accenture, focusing on trends in the news media landscape in several European countries. The discussion will analyze why newspaper revenues have declined, where the growth in online advertising has come from, evolving audience preferences, and what the interplay between the large and the smaller media publishers, journalists, internet platforms are like, and what the audience is likely to look like itself going forward. It's my pleasure to kick off this discussion by introducing Amit Singh, who's the managing director of Accenture Australia. Has been a leading light in producing this major report, whose contents now will be revealed by Amit in an introductory presentation, after which we pass on to a discussion. So without further ado from me, over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Paul. I might just wait till the presentation comes up. Terrific. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity and the chance to share some insights from our report. As Paul mentioned, the media landscape in Western Europe has fundamentally changed in the past 2 decades. The internet has obviously democratized how content is created and consumed, enabling new channels and communications between businesses and consumers. These changes have significantly disrupted traditional newspaper revenues, and this report that we are going to walk you through and some of our analysis that we've conducted has been conducted using a combination of public data, industry reports, and engaging with key sector participants. We might move to the next slide, please. So what has caused the decline in newspaper revenues? We'll move to the next slide, please. So we focused on the window where newspaper revenues went through an inflection, from growing to its peak in the early 2000s to a period of rapid decline. The shape of this curve is consistent across all Western economies that we studied, pre-financial crisis and then in the decline. The trend is the starting point, or it's really the fundamental question of our analysis. How should we understand this particular decline? We'll move to the next slide, please. So we looked at the decline of each of these. We looked at this decline over three components of newspaper revenue. These are well understood classifications shared by most data providers. And what we really find was that the decline in classifieds is the largest driver of the overall change. It's almost half of all the countries in Western Europe that we studied. We'll go to the next chart, please. Now, pure play websites or online pure play websites have captured the majority of these of this classifieds market. But the real story, as we can see from the chart in front of us, but the real story is that it's probably even worse for newspapers. Providers like Airbnb get their revenue through business models that are not considered classifieds in the statistics. Even some of eBay's revenues sit outside what is traditionally called classifieds. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram replace the traditional birth, deaths, and marriages notices. LinkedIn, you get more job notices in LinkedIn, and Facebook and others can be used for secondhand goods. All of this is traditionally classified activity, but it's not categorized today as classifieds revenue. So what you can sort of see is that the big shift has moved towards sort of online pure play. We might move to the next slide, please. So where did this growth of online advertising revenue come from? Overall expenditure has grown, but part of that is a displacement and part of that is growing into new markets. We can see a pretty substantial sort of growth, but we can also see that there's been some sort of shift. We'll go to the next slide, please. So if we quantify the above, about 2/3 of that is in new market growth. Now, part of the reason why that's the case is because advertising is getting cheaper, but more importantly, more people are getting into advertising. Online platforms have provided an opportunity in which small and medium enterprises and a whole range of other people that would not typically participate in the advertising market are now participating. We'll go to the next slide, please. So how have reader preferences changed over this time? More people are reading the news, and they're doing it frequently. What we've seen is that the number of people reading the news has grown reasonably substantially between 2000 and 2000 has grown reasonably substantially. What we're also seeing is that people are doing it more frequently. So over the last 15 years, more people have been reading the news, but what's been interesting over that period of time is that they're also doing it a lot more frequently. And that's the case across most of the countries that we studied. Go to the next slide, please. But the interesting thing is that they're getting their news from elsewhere. So you can see declines in television news, you can see declines in sort of print, but you can also see increases in online and in social media. And we think that this consumer behavior should be understood as the biggest driver of the changes described above. Go to the next slide, please. So as readers spend more time online, we're seeing more innovations. Publishers are innovating by improving first-party data, reimagining content distribution, and mainstreaming digital subscriptions. So just recapping, what we've seen is that there's been a dramatic decline in newspaper revenues. The explanation for that decline in newspaper revenues is that the majority of that has moved away from the classifieds market. We've seen a growth in online advertising expenditure. We've seen some of that has been from displacement, and some of that has been growth in new markets. We know that about 2/3 of that growth has been from advertising getting cheaper and more people getting into advertising. And we've also seen a series of different trends about how consumers are consuming the news. More people are reading the news, and they're reading it more frequently, but they're also getting their news from different sources. And this consumer behavior is really the biggest driver of the changes that we described above. There's more opportunity for innovation here. We're seeing that through publishers innovating through first-party data, reimagining content distribution, and mainstreaming digital subscriptions. I might pass it back to Paul to see if he's got any questions.
Thank you very much, Amit. A question that springs to mind watching your presentation. Obviously, when you start the research, you're not sure what you're going to find before you do the research, by definition. But were some of these findings as a surprise to you and your colleagues?
Yeah, they were. In fact, I think when we approach this question, and I sort of understand that there's there's different sort of perspectives that you come to it. It was a little we were a bit surprised about how clearly this was borne out in each of the different markets that we studied. What's interesting is that when you speak to people in the industry, they don't find this particularly interesting. People that are close to this particular close to the sort of media sector that understand sort of the shifts in advertising, particularly the shifts in the classified markets, say that this is sort of something that they've kind of intuitively known, but it's interesting to sort of see it quantified. I think everybody knew that there was a period in which there was this sort of rivers of gold, the rivers of gold sort of reflection around classifieds, but they never really thought about how that shift had actually played out. So it was a bit surprising to us, basically based on our priors, but I think the data and the way in which the data plays out, not just in the analysis in Western Europe, but across a range of different countries, I think probably shows a different conclusion to perhaps where we may have started from.
And before moving on to the panel discussion, one last question. I mean, what do you intend to do with this report now? Obviously, today is one of the many presentations I presume you'll be making. What do you have, apart from just taking the assignment from whoever's paying for all the work, but I mean, did you have a kind of agenda, a strategy to how to roll out this presentation and the findings?
Look, I think what we found was that we did this study in a few countries to begin with, and as we've done it in other countries, we feel like what it does, it contributes to the research on this particular subject and research on this subject as we think about what the future of news media should look like. We think this will be interesting for a range of different stakeholders, researchers, think tanks, policymakers, companies, different innovators. We think it'll also be interesting for people buying advertising, small and medium enterprises. So really, I think our we don't have a strategy. I think what we're really interested in is understanding and bringing more research to this particular discussion. It's obviously a very important discussion, thinking about the future of news media, and we want to see this across a range of different geographies. We've tried to do this work, beyond Western Europe as well, just to sort of see whether those trends going to play out. But I think that's fundamentally where our work is headed.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to the panel discussion. You stay online because you're going to be part of the panel, Amit, so we'll come back to you certainly. And let me introduce now, with great pleasure, first of all, Lara Natali, who's Director for Tech, Media and Telecom at the independent think tank SER, and Anne-Sophie Christensen Dalsgaard, who's Chairman of the Board of New Media in Denmark and member of the European Innovative Media Publishers Association. I think we should first of all ask each of you in turn, Lara and Anne-Sophie, to react, maybe respond to the presentation, then we'll move on in the time available to us to a broader discussion about the impact of the findings on the regulatory agenda in Brussels, certainly, and also how the industry is responding. But Lara, first of all, over to you. What's your initial take on Amit's presentation?
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Paul, and thanks Forum Europe as well for having me on this panel today. It's always a pleasure collaborating. And I've learned a lot from Amit already. Congratulations. I thought your presentation gave important colour on the report for me, and I certainly recognise some of my own behaviours and some of the observations on news consumption. And so just to add from the standpoint of the Centre on Regulation in Europe, SER, we are an independent think tank. You were hoping the research would be useful to us, which it will be. As our name might indicate, we mostly focus on how market trends impact on regulation, both the sort of fit for purpose tests around existing regulation and how we might think ahead to the future of regulation. So I'll try to focus on those angles to the report and address the various media forms that you go through in the trends. So maybe a quick remark on print and online media to start, because circulation revenues for print media, I think, have been and remain a pretty ubiquitous story, and maybe even beyond the time frame of the Accenture report, because I'd understood that the decline in newspaper revenues had already started a bit ahead of 2003, sort of the pre-innovation area, but I certainly understand it got sharper after 2003. I think for me, two striking statistics highlighted in the report are firstly how the overall advertising market pie has increased and grown, and second also that the impact and displacement on print advertising is significant, but we don't see so-called legacy media being completely out of the ad game, far from it, actually, at least in aggregate. And I mean, for me, maybe more granularity in any future work would be really welcome there. In particular with ad tech being a growing focus of potential regulatory, certainly antitrust action. I think even just yesterday I was reading about Commission Executive Vice President Vestager here in Europe making some announcements on that front. And then maybe if we consider TV and radio alongside print and online media, we for me, you know, at SER, we think about regulatory framings. We have the basis for looking at two major ones that I think are interesting in the context of this report. You know, in Europe, we talk a lot about a competitive Europe, the quest for tech sovereignty, and how regulation fits into that. And one framing that you point to in the report is promoting innovation. So in Europe, we hear a lot about how we need to promote innovation, not stifle it, which I always find a tricky argument to calibrate, because by design, any regulation will stymie some forms of innovation while promoting others at the same time. And I think the Accenture report suggests a fairly steady state in ad revenue terms for radio and TV. I mean, for me, these are both media forms with internet, and we can say as well that these businesses have leveraged innovation to diversify and make sure they stay in the game. So I'm thinking of radio stations branching out into podcasts, or TV with its on-demand service offerings. And then the second framing after innovation that we always talk about in Europe is the level playing field from SMEs, which you know, throughout Europe is like the overwhelming bulk, the beating heart of the European economy. So I thought, Amit, when the line about increased SME participation in advertising, you know, that's going to be politically compelling here, even as the space becomes more scrutinized. and regulated. And then, of course, you talked a lot about pure play sites. For me, maybe there's, I find myself thinking, what about big tech? Is that the big elephant in the room or the report? And I think very well, the report doesn't dispel some of the downsides for legacy media that come from the evolution of the market, and certainly the barriers for newspapers to diversify. They appear very high when considering how to innovate to compete. But looking to your recommendations on digital subscriptions across publications, for me, that's a very interesting option to consider, because there could certainly be the positives as you outlined, but also could it bring even further downsides for legacy media? Maybe I wonder if it could eat into their revenues. If rather than subscribing to individual publications separately, consumers were to demand a paper article model or an overall bundle of subscriptions, I suppose at least I wouldn't have the information to hand to know whether it's a recommendation that might be a threat or opportunity, and a scenario that I think would be really interested to see further developed. And the same too on the first party data recommendation for measuring and building audiences. That's such an interesting analysis. And for me, any future work that brings a more comprehensive, let's say SWOT type analysis would help stress test whether it's an idea with legs. So I think maybe on balance, it's a report that's very interesting reading. It leaves me with many new questions, which is a positive sign because it's a snapshot on market trends. What does all the regulation under development mean for the future of news media? This is still intensely national in nature. There's maybe an even more existential question about what kind of news media landscape Europe might need or want to maintain the so-called European values. How do we maintain measured and evidence-based negotiations around regulation that might follow from what we see in the trends? And maybe lastly, yesterday I think I saw a study published. It was made for the European Parliament's IMCO committee, where the authoring team warned that all this new legislation under development, it won't protect people from controversial practices around ad tech unless lawmakers strengthen transparency measures, force tech platforms to let users opt out of targeted ads. So there's just plenty more to say, on this fascinating topic. It's a thought-provoking report from Brussels Effect perspective too. I may have gone over time already. I'll leave it there for now and look forward to picking up the regulatory aspects later.
Thank you, Lara. We'll expand on your points in the discussion. Over to you, Anne-Sophie. A similar question I asked Amit. You're obviously in the business. Were you surprised by some of these major findings, or will you more or less confirm what you already knew?
Thank you, Paul. Am I on? My video?
Yes, you're on. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Good. I was just not sure. I don't know if you want me to introduce my organization.
Yes, please. A few words about yes, please.
Yes. So I represent New Media and IMP, the European Innovative Media Publishers, and our members are these innovative new startup media that are dynamic and usually rely on digital outlets. And the work of the IMP started when the European Commission launched its work on copyright reforms, which we thought would have a negative impact on our members. So we've been following that really closely, and on the national level as well. I've been debating and discussing this with the politicians too. So we represent an often overlooked group, and we're really happy to be included in this discussion and to be able to see things from our side. And as you asked, I think the numbers from Amit's report, it's really interesting, and it corresponds well with our experience, with what we've seen. The advertising, we see that mainly in the local media, where they're quite successful in working with the local SMEs and the local businesses, which is wonderful to see, because there's been a lot of worry about the local media and how well they do with this digital transition. And also a lot of our members are quite successful in gaining memberships subscriptions, that type of thing. So we just have different business models that work well in this digital world. So really, when something like the copyright directive comes along and we have to, readjust, it affects us quite a lot. So, like Laura said, in terms of stifling innovation, something like that is worrying to us because we're not as well established as the legacy media. We don't have the same funding as they do, so it impacts us quite a lot.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ansel. I seem to have had a brief echo there. It's gone now. Wonderful. And I'll come back to you, Emmett, because I have so many questions Lara said in your presentation. There's this kind of narrative caricature sometimes, received wisdom that the legacy media, as Lara calls it, traditional media, were caught sleeping. They didn't know how to respond to new technology, and all these new hotshot type tech companies coming along, stealing their lunch, stealing their dinner, stealing their breakfast. But you paint a slightly paradoxical picture. So these findings were presented to some of the media players. They weren't surprised by them. My question to you on the back of that, therefore, are there clear signs now that media, different kinds of media, have a better handle on what the situation is like, and therefore that informs better their own strategies for responding to technological developments and consumer developments, and how to maximize new revenue streams? Because, as you say, there is a growing advertising market out there, which most people didn't think, I think, was the case until you brought it to our attention.
Yeah, so I think just answering sort of the two questions. I think the first one I should say is when I said that many people in the industry were not surprised. I think many of the advertisers, or many people that sort of thought about the advertising market were not surprised about some of the findings. I think that there would be some that may be surprised at, as I think Lara sort of alluded to. What I'd say on the second piece is I think that while some of those innovations have sort of flowed through at different levels, what is clear is that there are greater examples of people basically picking up on some of those sort of innovations. And I think what we're hoping this report sort of shows is that as people find new ways or use those kind of innovations to change certain models, that there is actually a bigger advertising pie to access. We think that a lot of those shifts are also a function of where those particular classified websites are owned. I mean, in many cases, a lot of them are part of like larger sort of media conglomerates. I mean, and so therefore there's a sort of shift within those particular entities as well. But I think to answer your question, or answer in particular your second question, Paul, is I think that it's clear that there's a shift towards some of those innovations that I mentioned around the mainstreaming of first-party media, the way in which you think about sort of subscription model, so first-party data, the way in which you think about subscription models and other types of innovations that particularly sort of newspaper and news media sort of companies have started picking up on.
Thank you, Emmett. We're going to come to questions from the audience in a second because I can see they're starting to come in. But before I do that, let me go back to you, Lara, please. I mean, in terms of the EU regulatory world you and I live in, certainly, and the policy-making machine in Brussels, there are some major initiatives in the van der Leyen Commission, as you know better than I do, in this area. I suppose one interesting thing is to what extent these initiatives, no matter how well-intentioned they are based on maybe an incomplete knowledge of the industry background in which they're designed to action. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's certainly a fast evolving market. So when we're talking about regulation and regulatory design, there's already with the digital single market, which was conceived back in sort of 2014, that was meant to be there to sort of bring a lot of the existing rules up to speed with the evolved markets, and there were a lot of assessments done, impact assessments, etc. And that's certainly the model the institutions still use now. I mean, to your point about the what we're seeing with the raft of new regulation, I think it's important maybe to start with the basis that we already have a lot of rules, those digital single market instruments indeed, and they aim to update and rebalance rules to account for digital news media, certainly, and actually the increasing role of social media too, that Amit outlined, that impacts on consumer news consumption. And the nature of those instruments, they're mostly sort of directives and regulation that are based on a sort of country of establishment or origin enforcement sort of responsibility that's meant to take into account, differences in markets and the sort of national colour that Accenture have also picked up on in their more country-specific reports. And today we have this raft of new proposals indeed, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, Data and Data Governance Act, and AI Act, all these other instruments making up a so-called Digital Single Market 2.0. But I think the big shift is that we're seeing a shift towards centralised EU enforcement. And so the question there is, to your question, Paul, indeed, like, can a centralised enforcement model take account, have the information it needs and be flexible enough and nimble? And I mean, at SER, our academics sometimes use the word administrability, like, is it enforceable enough in a practical way to take into account all those changes? I think the keeping pace mechanism is an ongoing question, and one of the things we have in previous research advocated for is better systems of sort of oversight of industry with more regulatory dialogue, better coordination mechanisms among national authorities, these sorts of process-based points that maybe take into account, create a model where you can reflect a quickly evolving, innovative market better.
Right. And a quick question to you, Anne-Sophie, before I move to questions from the audience. You're a relatively new organization and a relatively small organization, I suppose. Do you have any sense that you are getting, do you feel that you're getting your due access in terms of policymakers? They know who you are, or are they so used to dealing with the more traditional players? I mean, I don't want to give too many leading questions, but it's important that all voices are represented, I suppose, and it'd be helpful the policy-making point of view, if I was inside the European Commission, to see a growing tendency towards some kind of agreement amongst industry players, because that makes the life of the policymaker a tiny bit easier.
Yes, thank you. We do actually feel noticed, and it's happened during this past year with the discussion about the copyright directive being implemented in Denmark. And for some reason, they're listening to us now, and it's just really great to be a part of the discussion. And they're also sort of starting to notice both our business models, that we bring something new to the table. We have different solutions to the whole, use of media and the democratic way of talking together that we play a role in. So we actually do feel like we're being included in the discussions now, but it's only just now that it's happening. So it's going to be really interesting to see if we actually do get an impact on this.
I think it's only fair to go to audience questions now, because time is running out, and we need to address these questions as we invite people from the audience to take part in this discussion. First question is from Maria Lehmann, who's a media consultant. Does the arguable erosion of trust in media, asks Maria, play a role in changing where advertising is spent? Gosh, that's a difficult question, but that's why I'll give it to Amit first of all. Do you have any view on that?
That is an interesting question. We haven't looked at it. we didn't look at the relationship between trust and sort of where advertising is spent. In some of the specific country reports, we did look at sort of trust in media and its implication for this shift between sort of print circulation to sort of online circulation, and the impact that has sort of had, and the way in which many countries have, or some countries have basically had a better ability to make that transfer. So we have looked at that trust in that particular context, but not in the specific context that Maria has sort of mentioned.
Yeah, well, you're not from opinion polls. A question now addressed to Lara from Sean Khan of KLTV. So other people are also invited to respond if they want to. The question is as follows, Lara. Could you comment on the role of public service broadcasters in Europe and the impact on them of the changing media landscape? More commercial pressure, more private broadcaster choice, more online, on demand, etc. Is it important that we retain public service broadcasters in Europe, asks Sean.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the question. It's a really interesting one. I mean, I'm led to first of all think of something Anne-Sophie mentioned. Anne-Sophie, it was really interesting to hear you say that because of the not being as well established as legacy media, the fragility in terms of taking regulation and the impact regulation has. I think for me, and it's maybe more a personal view than a set view, but any plurality and diversity to the media landscape is really, really important. And I think public service broadcasters, they bring certainly a long tradition. They have a different angle to the sort of content they show. A lot of lessons to teach. I would be very wary of making a blanket statement around there not being a need for public service broadcasting that indicates wanting to narrow the media landscape. And certainly I still think country by country the landscape is different, but certainly across many of the countries I'm more familiar with and where I consume media myself, they've uniformly sort of enriched the landscape. So I'm sure there still is a great role to play, but I do understand the pressures. It's interesting that among those pressures, regulation and taking regulation wasn't mentioned because, again, the thing with public service broadcasting is the existing dialogue, though independent, the existing dialogue with the national regulator, with the national government is perhaps better established. So that's not necessarily more of a pressure than a commercial broadcaster or an innovative media publisher would have. So anything that enriches the landscape is important.
And I suppose it's also, I think it's slightly, I think we can all believe in public sector broadcasting, most people anyway, but the question is how it's financed and to what extent is it allowed to go into the private sector area of activity to raise revenue. A question back to you, Amit, from the audience. Do you have any more detail on why there is such a large variation, Italy versus Germany, for instance, as to why so many more Italians than Germans get their news from social media?
Yeah, I think that was actually a really interesting question for us as researchers when we actually made that finding, and so we actually dug in a little bit deeper into it. Germany is a really interesting example, Germany I think is a really interesting sort of case here because in Germany they've been able to increase circulation revenue because of basically a very strong, innovative and trusted industry. And daily newspaper readership in Germany is up from the sort of, is much higher than the sort of Western European average. You've had sort of German newspaper companies such as Axel Springer that have been fast to sort of adapt to these changing market demands and develop like interesting and kind of robust digital platforms that are able to offer new content. So you've seen their kind of revenues, or at least the sources of revenues from digital, grow reasonably substantially while not seeing the sort of losses in print that say others may have had. But the other interesting thing I think in Germany is that the press, or there's an incredibly high degree of trust in the press, and this goes back to the kind of earlier question where we didn't look at it in that context that I think Maria's question had, but we did did sort of think about in the context of this sort of how people are consuming the news. And it's really interesting that in Germany, which is one of those places where daily newspaper readership remains reasonably high, and it's some of the highest readership levels in the world, that's been a function that's also correlated a little bit with the relatively higher average on sort of trusted news. It's much higher than the Western European average. It's much higher than the global average. So I think that those things point pictures to the future about why that difference exists. Obviously, as researchers, when we saw that, we were very curious and interested to know why. But I think Germany points a good example for why that is the case.
Thank you. A question I'll address to you, Anne-Sophie, from the audience, from Caroline in Belgium. In context of Amit talking about more people are consuming news. So the question to you, Anne-Sophie, is, could you comment on the quality of that news output? Do you think that the quality of news is going up, going down, very stable, or whatever?
That's a good question. I'd like to say that for my members, we do believe that our content is high quality, and that our business model supports the high quality journalism that they produce. I'm not really sure about the legacy media and how it fits with their business models. It does seem like fast news, clickbait is on the rise. So, and I don't regard that as being high quality. More of a creating conflicts and controversy on social media. Adding to the polarization of politics, that sort of stuff.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Sophie. Next, a question addressed to Lara and also to me, but very, very strangely, but I'm not going to answer it. So just you, Laura, you're on your own. In the new makeup of the EU, without the UK as a member, I think Paula da Costa of Rainmaker LLP means that the UK not being at the table. The direction of travel for policymaking in this important area is it already changing for good or for bad in your view, Lara?
Does my accent give it away? Well, yes. So disclosure that in a past life, or in the UK's past life, I was also an attaché for what was then the UK Perm Rep in Brussels. So negotiating legislation sort of around the table. So I certainly had insights when the UK was around the table, and now I think it's bound to be different, partly because, negotiations are largely about voting numbers, and countries with a lot of votes, their opinion sort of just matters by design of the proportional representation model we have in Europe of qualified majority. But also I think the UK had a very particular line around interpretation of the treaties, checks and balances. And I think that's something that was widely seen and respected about the UK approach. So no doubt that is still there, but I can see how you'd need a lot more countries having a certain viewpoint for that to sort of be reflected in some of the amendments made to legislation. And also, and I think this is objective rather than subjective, the national regulators in the UK in this area brought a lot of experience, are heavily staffed. A lot of the content, maybe not so much news media, but if we look at, say, audiovisual media, where a lot of the content shown across linear and on-demand services came from the UK. So, the UK has a big tradition in this area. So I think it probably will change a bit, not necessarily for the better or the worse. It will just be different. And also because this is an intensely cultural space, I think, which is a very important precept to understand around news media. Which is why it can get very emotional. I mean, Anne-Sophie pointed to the copyright directive at some point. I think we'd all like to learn lessons from what happened in the copyright directive. That was so emotional and so polemic. And the UK was always had quite a sort of, I mean, not neutral, but certainly, I mean, balanced is also subjective, but, it definitely didn't have it wasn't one of the more emotional led positions. So it'll be interesting to see now next time we have something with that strength of feeling what it's like without the UK.
Okay, thank you. Since you mentioned copyright directive, thank you. Sorry. Since you mentioned the copyright directive, as did Anne-Sophie in her opening remarks, there's a question from the audience to you, Anne-Sophie, about the copyright directive, in particular its transposition in Denmark and the impact on your company, New Media. Could you give us some insights on that, please?
Yes, of course. Well, it was just passed into Danish law a few weeks ago, so it's being implemented right now. And what happened in Denmark is the government chose to go a bit further than what was expected from the EU. So they made it possible for Danish media to negotiate collectively. So they formed a CMO, like an organization to handle the new copyright directive and do the negotiation for the media as a collective. We were quite worried about it from new media, because we would then be in the same group as a big legacy media, and they would have a big interest in getting money from the tech companies, and we're not really interested in this part of it, because we feel like the way we use Facebook, for instance, it doesn't make sense to claim this right, because we use it, and it's really important to be able to use it freely in the way our businesses work.
To a close pretty much soon, so I'm gonna, like I often like to do, is ask a similar question to all the panelists to finish off on, and we'll go in the order of Amit, Lara, and Anne-Sophie. And luckily, a gentleman in the audience has done my work for me. He's tabled a question which I was going to kind of thinking about asking you as well. This is from Sebastian Rimoy in Creab, the consultancy. Is media plurality, asks Sebastian, strengthened or weakened by the move to online and the shift in advertising spending? It's like almost a philosophical political question, but over to you, Amit, to try to answer it.
I think to Lara's point earlier, I think a lot of it depends on particular context. I mean, I think this is intensely localized, or sort of intensely national kind of national market, and so it depends a lot. A lot of this depends very much on the particular contexts. I think what we've seen, at least what we've seen in terms of what we've studied, is that it does provide newer opportunities for people to participate, and it both in the kind of plurality side, but also in terms of people that are able to access and also be able to advertise. And so what we think is that, at least from that perspective, I'd say that it probably strengthens plurality, but there are obviously a lot of context around that, and and that would require a lot more careful study and a careful data work.
Thank you, Amit. Lara?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's quite a philosophical question indeed. I would agree with Amit that it's an extremely high context question. I would maybe say that it's very localized, but also part of media plurality is maybe media ownership also, and that's where we see sort of the regulation and antitrust intersection, which is getting a lot of attention, both at Central European level and more nationally. And it will be really interesting, I think, from a SER perspective, and I'd love to see more Accenture work in due course to see how this kind of central EU-wide oversight and enforcement plays into that media plurality evolution. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Lara. And finally to you, Anne-Sophie.
Thank you. I very much agree with Amit and Lara on this as well. And I think we, as new media, we represent this growing plurality of the media, and we see our members growing, and they're quite successful with the business models and reaching their readers. So I do think this is great for plurality. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we're going to finish off there. I mean, this is kind of a good, forgive the pun, a good news story, because there has been a narrative out there until quite recently that traditional media, new media, by the way, often are suffering. The revenues are not there. The consumers aren't there. People expect stuff for free online. The other big dominant players are taking all the proceeds. But then there's this other more positive narrative whereby as Amit made very clear in his presentation, advertising spend is increasing, but in different forms of media. New kinds of people are advertising who haven't historically advertised, which is good news. As importantly, traditional media are responding. They're waking up to the new challenges, but also they are investing in online and getting results of that, because in many areas, as I'm told, paid subscriptions are increasing in quite substantially in certain media outlets. And on top of all that, and maybe we can thank Donald Trump for that, or even other parts of the world who are not so benign towards the West, a taste and a thirst and a desire and appetite for real media, for substantive media, as opposed to fake media. So I think let's try and finish this interesting discussion we've had this morning on that positive note. I thank Amit, I thank Lara, and I thank Anne-Sophie for taking part in this very interesting discussion. Thank you for all watching out there in the audience, especially if you asked a question to the panel. Just for me to say thank you to everybody, and see you next time. Have a good day.